Everybody, thanks for watching. Now, the reason why I wanted to do this video on quantum physics is to show you how complicated we and the universe really is. Having this basic understanding of quantum mechanics will help you to understand and help you to take your mind off of what you can actually see and to focus on how we and the universe actually works on a quantum level. Now, this video will be a lot different from, your usual videos on quantum mechanics and quantum physics. And if this is the first time you have seen my videos, then I suggest you go back and watch previous videos because I do things a lot different from most people. Now, most religious people will look out into the universe. They will look at the sun, the moon, the stars. They will look at the people, and they will say that, religion must be real because we exist. Our religious doctrines tell us, how we got here, who put us here. But once we begin to understand quantum physics, we will see that human beings are a lot more complicated than simply taking dust from the ground. Now, when we look at every physical thing in the universe, we see that everything is made up of atoms, electrons, protons, and neutrons. When we look around at our world, we can see that we have things that are made of liquid or solid. If you put your hands on the surface of a liquid, we can see that our hand will actually pass through a liquid. But if you put your hand on the surface of a solid, say like a wall, then your hand will not pass through a wall. But when we examine this interaction on a quantum level, that's exactly what should happen. Our hand should actually pass through the wall. So how is that possible, and why doesn't that happen? Now, believe it or not, atoms are actually 99.9% of empty space. So that means that the atom is almost made entirely of empty space. So why is it that we don't just, fall through the floor? Why don't our hands simply pass through the wall? Now, the whole thing is when we look at atoms, when two atoms come into close contact with each other, the electrons actually exchange particles called photons. The exchange of these particles causes the electrons to push away from each other. This sensation is what we know as touching. Now, this all happens on a microscopic level because atoms are ultra small, but we can actually go even smaller. Now, when we examine the atom, we see that it is an electron orbiting around a nucleus of protons and neutrons. Now, when we look at protons and neutrons, we see that they are made of tiny bits of matter called quarks. Now, when we look into quantum chromodynamics, we see that, these quarks are basically the building blocks of protons and neutrons. Now, when we go even smaller from quarks, we get into what is known as string theory. Now, string theory deals with tiny vibrating strings of energy that combine all of the forces in nature, all of the basic particles, and their interactions. Now, the thing is, when we ask ourselves, if everything in the universe is made up of atoms, then why is it that, everything isn't, the same? Why do things look different? Why do we have liquids and solids? Why do we have things that are shiny and things that are, dark? What is going on with that? So the whole thing is when we examine string theory, we see that it is these tiny vibrating strings of energy that determines the properties of a particle or the mass of a particle. So basically the difference between us and everything in the universe depends on how these strings vibrate. There are four interactions that particles go through: strong nuclear interaction, weak nuclear interaction, electromagnetic interaction, and gravitational interaction. Now, the problem is gravitational interaction conflicts with the other three interactions. Strong and weak nuclear interaction and electromagnetic interaction are all explained by quantum physics. Gravitational interaction is explained by Einstein's theory. So, string theory is basically combining all four interactions so that they unify, so that they make sense. And what string theory tells us is that our universe is made up of multiple dimensions. And depending on how these strings vibrate, they can be detected in three-dimensional space as matter, light, or gravity. Now, three-dimensional space is our dimension. We basically have three spatial dimensions: up, down, left, right, back, forward. So it's how these strings vibrate that is determining whether something is matter or energy. Now, the thing with physics and science is getting the math correct, getting the equations to make sense. Now, if your math is wrong and the equations don't equate, then your experiments cannot be proven as physics or science, and they fall in that whole realm of philosophy. Sure, it sounds all theoretical, but it cannot be proven to with a mathematical certainty. Now, this is the problem that we run into with string theory. String theory does not make sense in a universe that only has 3 spatial dimensions. So in other words, the math does not equate in a universe that does not have multiple dimensions. Now, we know the strings are there, but the math does not add up in a universe without multiple dimensions. Now, physicists ran into a problem when they discovered 5 major string theories with 5 different sets of equations that contradicted each other about the same thing. Now, in 1994, a man named Edward Witten, along with a few other scientists, came to the conclusion that these 5 different equations were not wrong at all, that they were in fact talking about the same thing, but from different perspectives. So think about it as looking into a funhouse mirror. When you look into a funhouse mirror, you get multiple views about the same person. So what these physicists were able to do was combine all 5 major theories into one theory called M theory. Now, no one knows officially what the M stands for, but most physicists believe it stands for membrane, since M theory tells us that these strings are really one-dimensional slices of a 2-dimensional membrane vibrating in an 11-dimensional space. So, I know it all sounds confusing, but it's going to make a lot of sense as we go on. Now, understand, even if all of the math is correct, even if all of the equations make sense, a theory is still a theory until it is tested and proven to be true. So now, with string theory and M theory talking about extra dimensions, of course, this theory has to be tested to be proven true. So now this brings us into modern day and this. Yes, CERN in Geneva, Switzerland, where they have built a large hadron collider where they will send particles in near the speed of light in hopes that 2 particles will collide, and this collision will generate enough energy that will force the debris from our dimension to force the particle into another dimension. So what they will do is they will measure the amount of energy before the collision, and if there is less energy, then this means the dimensions are actually there, that they really exist. Now, I said everything I just said in this video. I gave you the whole history, talked to you about particles and electrons and atoms, M theory and string theory, and told you all of this to get you to understand what CERN was really about. It's done, it's over with, we are still here. Now, instead of these people doing actual research and telling you everything I just told you, they decided to put all of these spooky videos on YouTube to scare people, telling people that CERN was going to open up a dimension where demons were going to come out and suck our blood, and Satan was going to come into the world through this dimensional portal, and none of that happened. Now, the whole thing is we have to realize that were there actually physicists in Geneva, Switzerland doing an experiment that would risk the entire planet, don't you think that other governments would have came and rallied to stop them? Now, remember, these strings we are talking about are ultra small, much smaller than an atom. In fact, if an atom was the size of the sun, then these strings would still be smaller than an eyelash. So now, if ultra small strings in multiple dimensions were not, weird enough, it's about to get a lot more weirder. Now, when we start to examine the actions of atoms further, then things get a little bit spooky. Now, anybody who has studied physics knows all about the double slit experiment. Now, this is the double slit experiment. Now, you have 2 guns here. And what you would expect is if we fire these 2 guns, then the bullets will go through the slits and they would land on the wall in the position of the slits. So where the bullets will go through the slits at, we expect them to be in that same spot on the back of the wall. Now, the whole thing is, if we do this experiment, this will indeed happen. But if we change the bullets into, let's say, electrons, then the experiment will, yield the same results. The electrons will go through the double slits. They will land exactly where we expect them to land. Now, this is the weird part. When we observe this experiment, the electrons do exactly what we expect them to do. They go through the double slit, they land in that position on the wall. Now, the weird thing is when these electrons were fired without the physicists observing the experiment, they came out as waves. They traveled through the double slit and they landed at multiple positions along the wall. Now, this wave is called a probability wave, and at the height of these waves is where the electron will probably land along the wall. Now, the whole thing is, once they observe the experiment, the wave function collapses and the electrons turn back into particles. And we can understand that they're going to either land on this side and this side along the double slits. So they tried another experiment, and what they did was they didn't observe when the particle was fired and the electron came out as wave. It traveled through the double slit as a wave. And what they did was right before the wave hit the wall, they observed the experiment, and sure enough, the wave turned back into a particle. And it landed exactly where we think it would land. So what happened was the electron actually went back through time to right before it came out of the gun, turned back into a particle, went through the experiment as a particle, right before it was observed by the physicists, and landed right where we thought it would land along the double slit. Now, if that is not weird, I don't know what is. So basically, when we observe the experiment, we get particles. When we don't observe it, we get waves. Now, the same thing happens with light as well. Light travels in little particles called photons. Now, physicists have done experiments where light travels as waves. So, which is it? Particles or waves? Now, that depends on what you observe the experiment with. Now, light can either travel in particles or it can travel in waves, depending on what you use to observe it. So if you observe it with one thing, it will be a particle. Another thing, it will be a wave. It all depends on how it's observed. So this is a lot of spooky action, weird action that we get when we start dealing with light and particles, when we start dealing with atoms, waves, when we start dealing with the electron. There's a lot of action, a lot of weird things that take place that involves observation. So what are we talking about here? Consciousness. These experiments could not handle consciousness. In fact, they were altered by the scientists in the room observing the experiment. So consciousness itself changed the wave function into a particle. Now, since these experiments are dealing with, the atom, the electron, it's dealing with the very nature of our physical reality, what these experiments have in fact proven is our consciousness can affect our reality itself. So when physicists observe these experiments, their observation caused the waveform to change into a particle, and it forced the particle to choose a definite location instead of a probable location. So the implications for this are huge. So now let's go back and look at string theory. These strings vibrate at different frequencies, and depending on how they vibrate, it will determine whether something is matter or gravity or light. So now, what is it that makes these strings vibrate? And it's their intrinsic nature that these strings actually vibrate. But what else can we look to find frequency and vibration? And that is sound. Now, most of you have seen this video before. It is the frequency of the sound that is causing the vibration and making the sound change into different patterns. So now we're going to come back to this in part 2 of the Saturn video because it's very important. So now if our consciousness can actually affect the waveform of an electron, what else can it affect? So now if you've seen my previous video on human energy, I was speaking about the human heart. Now our heart is an energetic organ. It actually measures stronger than our brain. So now our heart puts out an electromagnetic field that encompasses our entire body 360 degrees. It can be detected as far as 3 to 12 feet away. So now we have an energetic organ. Our heart is an electric organ, which is why doctors can use a defibrillator to shock us back to life. So we have an energetic organ that is our heart, one that is our brain, and we have energy coursing through every cell in our body. So now, just like in the previous video on energy, I spoke about Dragon Ball Z. So now anybody who watches Dragon Ball Z, they know they speak about raising their power levels. And believe it or not, we have power levels as well. The average human actually measures between 30 and 100 millivolts. Now that's less than 1 full volt. Now some people can actually get up to 2,000 millivolts, which is actually 2 full volts. So now to put that in perspective, a television requires 25,000 volts of electricity to be powered. So that seems like we have a, pretty small amount of, power for us to sustain our life for, decades. So now in theory, if we raise our energy level, if we raise our consciousness, we should be able to affect reality in other ways than simply changing a wave into a particle. So what is stopping us? What is keeping us from doing that? Now, the weird thing is our heart is the strongest organ in our body. And the number one killer of human beings around the world is heart disease. So now if your heart goes out, that's it. You die. Now in Dragon Ball Z, what killed the strongest fighter in the universe? Goku. He died from heart disease. If you watch the Android saga, Goku dies from heart disease. It wasn't until Trunks went back in time to give him the cure that he actually survived. So now Akira Toriyama is actually trying to tell you a lot of things in Dragon Ball Z. If you don't watch it, I suggest you watch it, especially if you're into quantum physics. Now, anybody who studies physics know about 1927, the Fifth Solvay Conference in Brussels, Belgium, where physicists like Einstein and Niels Bohr and Heisenberg and all of the leading physicists of that time met to discuss electrons and protons. Now, in this conference, they spoke about quantum physics. They talked about how their experiments cannot be completed when there was a conscious observer in the room. So now most people look to this time as being the rise of quantum physics. Now, when we look at the atom, when we talk about matter and the electrons and energy, and when we study the atom, we're basically talking about, energy being trapped within matter. So where else can we look to find this story that predates this time? So now we know that people were talking about or getting into quantum physics, since the 1800s, but we can go back even further. So now when we look at the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, so the Nag Hammadi manuscripts are of Gnostic texts. The Nag Hammadi manuscripts were found in 1945 in Nag Hammadi, Egypt. And they talk about Gnosticism. They talk about, us being energetic beings trapped in flesh, trapped in matter. And this is what the Gnostic faith is about. It's about matter being evil and us being energy that needs to escape. So now we can go all the way back and look at these Nag Hammadi manuscripts. They were found 2 years before the Dead Sea Scrolls. And they talk about us being energetic beings. Now these Nag Hammadi manuscripts, they date back to 120 to 400 AD. But we can also go as far back as the 6th century BCE and look at the Greek philosopher Thales, who studied in Egypt, and he talked about the atom. Now, the word atom actually comes from the Greek word atomos. So here we have, during ancient times, people talking about the atom, people speaking about energy, talking about the power of electrons. Now, what happened was these physicists in the 1900s who talked about quantum physics, what they did was take the knowledge of the atom to the next level. So at this meeting in Brussels, Belgium, when they discovered how consciousness could affect, our physical reality, this must have, scared the powers that be, because a lot of things changed since the early 1900s. We got radio and we got TV and we got TV programming, and there was a whole war since then that has been geared at destroying our consciousness. Now, these scientists have basically figured out how powerful our consciousness really is. And it seems like since then, the powers that be, they do not want us tapping into that power. In fact, a man named Graham Hancock speaks on it. Take a look.
And in the interim, you made a comment at the end of your talk today about We need to take our consciousness back into our own hands.
I do feel very, very strongly that we do.
It's been co-opted by the media and by everything
well,
else.
Yes. First of all, on the input side, Western civilization has taken control of the consciousness of billions of people through the medium of television, projecting the ethic of Western culture. The consumerist, materialist ethic is beamed at us 24 hours a day on our TV channels. And secondly, on the other side, Western culture has criminalized and demonized all experiences involving altered states of consciousness and any substances that put us into an altered state of consciousness. And this is clearly a war over consciousness that's going on. It's clear that our societies have an investment in preventing us from exploring where altered states of consciousness will lead us. Perhaps there's a deep fear that if we do explore those altered states of consciousness, we will not accept the power structures and the fairy tale illusion of material wealth that we're all brought up to pursue as though that's the only thing to existence. Suppose that the ancient Egyptians and other cultures like that were right. Suppose they were right, that it's really vital, absolutely vital for us and for our eternal destiny what we do in this life. And then consider the predicament of billions of highly intelligent people who are lulled into a state of sleep by this consciousness bomb of television which is constantly being beamed at them, and who are not allowed to explore the mysteries of their own consciousness using the techniques of shamans that shamans have developed for thousands of years, using the plant hallucinogens. We are simply not allowed to do that. And if we do that, then we are considered to be criminals, and we are stigmatized by our society, and we are put in prison. This is a reversion to the world of the Spanish Inquisition. If I, as an individual, am not sovereign over my own consciousness, if I cannot decide what to do with my consciousness, which is the heart of my being, then I am not free. And I need not talk about freedom or living in a free society or such issues as democracy if my society will not allow me to explore my own consciousness. And that is the problem that we live in today, that our societies hate the idea of exploring altered states of consciousness and use every power structure that they have to prevent that from happening. If in an altered state of consciousness my behavior is disruptive in the public arena, then that behavior should rightly be controlled by society. But a personal and private exploration of our own consciousness is our own business, in my view, and is not the business of the state.
So since the 1800s, we've gotten radio. We've gotten radio shows. We've gotten TV and TV shows, TV programming. We've gotten Hollywood and a whole music industry, a whole movie industry. We've gotten the entertainment and sports industry. We've gotten all these things to keep us distracted, to keep our consciousness from growing. Now, the government has created the public school system and taken control of how we educate ourselves and our children. Now, they've done all this and continue to do all of this to what? To keep us from the tree of life. And that is, of course, why I wanted to get into quantum physics and tell you guys just this basic level of quantum physics to make you understand how important quantum physics is, because it is one of the roads that leads to the tree of life. Now, you can grow up and you can be a genius and you can study for decades and you might come close to discovering a major piece of the puzzle like, Einstein and these physicists have done. But that is highly unlikely today since so much information is controlled. It's so much that we don't know. And it's a lot that we don't know about the universe. Now, take, for example, everything we've talked about in this video so far has to do with the atom. So we talked about electrons, protons, neutrons, quarks. We've talked about string theory. Now, all of this has to do with the atom. Now, the thing is, when we look out at the physical universe, everything that we can see, I'm talking about all of the physical things like the planets, the suns, the moons, all of the meteors, all of the galaxies, all these things that we can see only make up 5% of the known universe. 5%. Just think about that. Now, 25% of the universe is what is known as dark matter. The other 70% is what is known as dark energy. And physicists, they really have no clue on what this stuff is made of. So now think about all of the movies and TV shows that's talking about quantum physics, and a lot of people don't even realize it. TV shows like Sliders and Quantum Leap. Now, believe it or not, quantum leap is something that actually occurs with electrons. It's called atomic electron transition. And it's when the electron changes from one quantum state to the next within an atom. So now what happens is the electron jumps from one power level to the next, and it skips everything in between. So now you got a bunch of TV shows and movies. We got Star Trek, and we got Star Wars, of course, and we got shows like Sliders and Quantum Leap and Stargate SG-1 and Atlantis, and anything that's talking about, portal jumping and time traveling or anything like that is talking about quantum physics. Now, you couldn't watch TV, you couldn't use your smartphone or get on the computer without quantum mechanics. Quantum physics deals with all of these things. We wouldn't have TV, we wouldn't have flat screens, we wouldn't have our, smart watch phones and all of these things without quantum mechanics, without quantum physics. So it's something that is very important that we understand and that we know, and we understand how it works. So now we know that there is a such thing as dimensions. It's not just something that somebody's seen in a TV show or in a movie, something that we just talk about for fun. This is something that has really been studied and is being, put out there as truth. So we have to look at these things and realize that these people are talking about dimensions, they're talking about energy, they're talking about a whole vast universe of things that we have absolutely no clue about. And on top of that, that our consciousness can somehow affect these things. That is a major thing that we are just not exploring because something or somebody don't want us to. And that's what we're going to get into a lot more in part 2 of, Saturn and Satan video. Now, there's a lot of things I left out of this video because I didn't want it to be too long. I didn't want to bombard it with too much information. I just wanted to get straight to the point. And like I said, this is not going to be a normal quantum mechanics or quantum physics video, but it's just something that I wanted you to get in your head and get you to go jump online or jump into books and just study more of, because when you start getting into quantum physics, and it's a lot more to it, it's a lot more to these dimensions, there's a lot more things that you should study on your own and understand. Now, thanks for watching. I'm glad to be back in Philly, back in America. I came here and, it's been good so far. I have a lot more videos to put out. I'm going to be attending school shortly, so I want to get as much videos out as possible. And unfortunately, sometime in the next couple months, I'm going to have to get my jaw wired shut, my mouth wired shut. And a lot of you may have picked up on it. I have a slight speech impediment. And it's hard for me to pronounce words due to an unfortunate accident that I have with my jaw. And I have to get my mouth wired shut, so I'm not going to be speaking for probably about a month, maybe 2. Now, that's going to make some people really happy, but I'm going to prepare a lot of videos before that time and get them out there. But this won't be till sometime next year. I think my book will be out by then. And I'll put out enough videos to last through that time. So I want to thank everybody for watching. I have more videos to come, and I'll see you guys next video.